The United States of America is infamously a two-party system. Um, I didn't need to tell you that. You probably knew that already. And perhaps also famously, our very first president warned against this pretty strongly. But for most of America's history, we've been a two-party system up since George Washington, really. Um, and it's always been very divisive. So now we have the Republicans and the Democrats, and of course, they're very divided on like a right left divide. And the two biggest issues right now are immigration and foreign policy. And yeah, so those are the two biggest issues right now. And of course, it's argued maybe the Democrats aren't really left, and maybe the Republicans aren't really right. You'll hear arguments from both sides regarding that. But we're not going to get into that because that's not what we're talking about. What we will be talking about is the very brief period in America's history where we were essentially a one-party system. And in order to talk about that, we do have to go all the way back to George Washington, who is actually our only president to have no political party affiliation. So imagine that. Isn't that interesting? And of course, he warned against the creation of two parties, but before there even were official parties, there was already a division. When we were trying to get the Constitution passed, there was the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted the Constitution to be passed. The Anti-Federalists did not. They preferred the Articles of Confederation or just not having a centralized government at all. They preferred states pretty much functioning as their own little countries, along the lines of, in their own times, the Holy Roman Empire, or in our times, the European Union. That was pretty much what the Anti-Federalists wanted. So imagine a world like that, very decentralized United States of America. And of course, the Anti-Federalists lost, and the Constitution was ratified. And that's how we got the United States of America. And right off the bat, there's already some division on what this new country should look like. So some of George Washington's closest political allies, those being Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, immediately have these huge disagreements. Thomas Jefferson is more along the lines of an anti-federalist, but not quite, because he wanted the Constitution to be passed. But his general concept of what this new country looked like was more inspired by perhaps the Enlightenment. He was all about decentralized government, no central bank necessarily, favoring France over England when it came to foreign policy, just like a lot more decentralized, more along the lines of the new American revolutionary concepts and concepts borrowed from the Enlightenment, whereas Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, while not necessarily monarchists, had a lot of traits that were similar to monarchism, and a lot of their concept of what America should look like sounded a lot like England. They were all about concepts like centralized government. They were not a fan of states' rights. They wanted a central bank. If I can recall correctly, they advocated for higher tariffs. They favored the industries and merchants and bankers over the common folk, farmers and agricultural workers and people living in rural areas. They were very much favored in New England and New York and the North in general. But yeah, so they were very, very different from the Democratic Republicans. That was Thomas Jefferson's politics in a lot of different ways. But yeah, so moving on. what ends up happening is after George Washington leaves office, his vice president, who was a Federalist, John Adams, becomes president. He was wildly unpopular because he did a lot of crazy kind of totalitarian things when he was president, like fully banning immigration and also basically ending the First Amendment. He basically said that if you criticize the government, you get arrested. So, of course, that went against the entire First Amendment, the very first one that was written down. So he was wildly unpopular and he lost after his first term. And Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, became president, and we never saw a Federalist president ever again. Now, they would still run candidates and they were still relevant, but they lost a lot of influence because of John Adams being just an awful president. But what ends up happening is Thomas Jefferson becomes president, and then after him it was James Madison, I believe, and another Democratic Republican, and he was against another Federalist, and that Federalist lost, and then eventually the War of 1812 happens, and at this point the Federalists basically disappear because they have become so unpopular at this point that they are totally unelectable. And the party still exists, but they are totally unelectable at this point because if you can remember what I mentioned earlier, they preferred England over France. So during the War of 1812, they fully were against the War of 1812. They were fully against us fighting England. They much preferred us not fighting England, us being friendly with the people that we just fought a war against in the American Revolution. And of course, because of their opposition to the War of 1812, they lost all of their influence. They still were somewhat relevant in New England, but by 1816 they were pretty much irrelevant. And it was at this point when James Monroe won against a Federalist, and after him, the Federalists were basically gone. So second time he runs for president, he has literally no competition. No one runs against him because the Federalists just don't matter at this point. So James Monroe's presidency is pretty much characterized as one, I wouldn't say without division, but to a certain extent, yeah, without division, because the Federalist Party is gone. The one party that was opposing the Democratic Republicans is completely gone. So there you go. Very brief one-party state. But what's interesting is after him came one of the most divisive elections in American history, but weirdly enough, it was still all operating under the Democratic Republicans. And that was, of course, the election of 1824 between Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams and someone else, I don't remember his name, but they were all running against each other. Very divisive election. There was a corrupt bargain. But what's weird is they were all still Democratic Republicans. And of course, because of this terrible election, Andrew Jackson goes, I don't like these people, and he decides to form his own party, the Democrats. And that is the same Democrats that are around today. However, their politics have definitely changed a lot. The politics of the early 19th century are not so relevant to the 21st century, but there you go. Andrew Jackson, he founds a Democratic Party, and at that point, the two-party system is back, and it basically doesn't go away, with some minor exceptions, like during the Civil War, the biggest Democratic states were not a part of the United States, so Abraham Lincoln didn't really have much competition. And also during the Great Depression and World War II, FDR won 4 times, which he was the only president to do that, and he will probably be the last president to do that unless something happens with the Constitution. But yeah, so there you go. That's something kind of interesting for you to think about. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.